having me. I am going to go ahead here and share my screen. I have a little presentation that I put together. So I created the Mushroom Color Atlas, which is an online reference and resource and educational site where people can go to learn about dyeing with mushrooms for different, making dyes for different fibers and so forth, as well as pigments for paint and everything. I thought I would start the evening off with a quote from Ursula Le Guin. I'm very lucky. Ursula Le Guin grew up in my neighborhood in Portland. And she says, to use the world well, to be able to stop wasting it and our time in it, we need to relearn our being in it. And I love starting off these talks kind of thinking about that as we reorient ourselves, especially thinking about being better stewards of the environment and the landscape and the planet and all those things. So a quick little background on my mushroom dye journey. I was on a trip. I'm often hiking through the forests and spending time in the woods. And I was on a trip with my husband and we were in the Tetons and the mushrooms were just exploding. And I thought, okay, this is a calling. I have got to take the time and join the Mycological Society and finally study and learn more and take identification courses and so forth. So I joined my local society. And as I did that, I have also spent a lot of time working with textiles and fiber. And I was kind of at this pivot point and I thought, you know, I don't really want to keep doing what I've been doing. I want to start to make my own fiber and patterns and designs and colors. And I thought, I wonder if mushrooms make color. And sure enough, up came on a Google search that they did. I learned all about Miriam Rice. And I brought my kind of two loves of mycology and fungi and mushrooms with textiles and fiber and fabric. Prior to this, I had a career in interactive media. My husband and I started an interactive design studio called Second Story. And so you'll see by creating the Mushroom Color Atlas, I really brought in my love of the digital world. We worked primarily with museums and cultural institutions, and we were dedicated to entertaining, educating, and inspiring through storytelling, innovation. So I worked with lots of archives and collections around the country. So that takes me to where I live now. The land where I live and the place where I call home, it stands on the lands of the Yakama Nation, whose ancestors have resided here since time immemorial. The community is Trout Lake, Washington, and I live at the base of Mount Adams that you see here, and have a huge national forest in my backyard, just 15 minutes up the road where I can forage for mushrooms. On my property, I have a flower farm, Bloom and Dye, where I grow specialty cut flowers and deliver CSA bouquets from April to September weekly to people in the community. And I also grow a lot of natural dye plants. I grow these all, harvest and dry and package and sell them, and they're all available on my website for purchase. So you can use those in different projects. With these flowers and plants that I grow, I'm making color and I'm making pigments and prints and all sorts of things. And then as Cornelia mentioned, I have a career in teaching higher education, graduate students that were getting Masters of Fine Arts. And so I have then brought that into my studio, teaching workshops here as well as other locations. And in my own work, I take what I am growing and creating and I work with textiles to make embroideries and so forth. These are some of the indigo and marigolds I grow in a piece here. And what's behind me on the wall are a lot of that's all mushroom dyed back there. Another quote I wanted to start with, hopefully you have all read Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life. There was a quote in there that really struck me, where he talks about that today more than 90% of all plant species depend on mycorrhizal fungi. They're the rule, not the exception, and they're a more fundamental part of planthood than the fruit, flowers, leaves, the wood, or even the roots. And he goes on and continues that, like, through this intimate partnership, even though it's complete with like cooperation and conflict and competition, that these plants and mycorrhizal fungi enact a collective flourishing that underpins our past, our present, and our future. And, you know, he says we are unthinking without them, yet seldom do we think about them. And the cost of our neglect has never been more important. And it's an attitude that we can't sustain any longer. And I think all of us who are part of mushroom clubs and societies understand that, but being able to be evangelists and talk with people who are curious and interested about the fungi kingdom, but don't know a lot, being able to get them to think more critically. So that takes me to dye mushrooms. Historical uses of fungi for dyeing is much longer than previously expected, thanks to the work of Dominique Cardoon. She published this in her book, Natural Dyes, Sources, Traditions, Technology, and Science. There's reference back to the Middle Ages, the 15th century, that there was this common element that was being used to achieve crimson colors from the insect dye kermes. And that was referred to as popo or opopo, which references agarico. And the agaricon was used for mordanting to brighten the colors. And so you can see agaricon here on the screen. There's also reference to this in the Gobelins dye workhouse in Paris in the 1660s, as well as Dutch manuscripts in 1631. So this use of polypores used for dyeing, it wasn't just in Europe, but it was in North Africa, it was in Central Asia, it was actually in Northwest North America where I live. And these polypores would give, you know, yellows, reds, violets, depending on the species, the fiber, the mordants. The tinder polypore that you see here would give different shades of yellow. So Phomos fomitarius, and it's the hoof fungus. And what's really interesting about a lot of these mushrooms, and specifically these polypores, is they're natural accumulators of alum. And alum is a mordant that we use when working with natural dyes. And a mordant, it's a French term that means to bite or to bind. And what happens when you're working with natural dyes is you need to treat the fiber with a mordant so that the natural dye will bind to it. Otherwise, it's kind of like a berry stain. We've all, you know, gotten the strawberry stain on our white shirts, and it eventually washes out. Well, if that shirt had been mordanted and that natural dye had affixed to it, it would be much harder to wash out. So these mushrooms not only have dyes and this chemical compounds for colors and pigments, but they also have them for mordants, which is really exciting. So the hoof fungus was actually, you know, it was used as a mordant, it was used for dyes, and then it has that inner velvet, the amadou, that you might have heard talked about, and that's, people were able to mash that to produce materials for felt hats in Transylvania. This mushroom would also be applied to wounds to kind of heal bleeding, and it would be used, you know, as like kind of wicks for tinder boxes to start fire. So a lot of uses from this mushroom. The mulberry polypore here creates different shades of yellow. And interestingly enough, both those mushrooms were used for dyeing up until recently in the Taklamakan Desert. And so what they've found throughout time is, you know, the silk route, the stops were kind of placed in these oases. And in these oases, these mushrooms were growing. And so not only were they trading the mushrooms along the silk route, but they were trading the knowledge transmission and sharing that so that others would start to use it. And now we get to one of my favorite mushrooms, Econodontium Tintorium. It's the Indian paint fungus, or simply known as ET, because I grew up in the era of the ET movie. And this was used by indigenous people on the west coast of North America. And so we have this here in my forest. It's the source of the bright red body paint that you would see that it was not only, the paint was not only used for like symbolic and aesthetic purposes, but it would actually protect the skin from sunburn and insects bites. It would reduce glare for snow blindness. But it is also a dye mushroom. So you can create these beautiful pigments from it, but you can create these dyes that can be a kind of pinkish, orangish, purplish color, depending, again, on the mordants and fibers. And then I always like to mention lichens here at this point, because a lot of people ask about lichens. The Mushroom Color Atlas is dedicated to fungi. It doesn't include lichens, but historically, there is a lot of significance in using lichens for dyes. They are in the fungi kingdom, but they're not actually a fungi themselves. I always like to say it's when a fungi and an algae took a lichen to each other. So I have worked with lichens in my own practice and so forth, but nothing extensively like I have with mushrooms. So I mentioned my Google search to see if mushrooms created dye, and I came across Miriam Rice. Paul Stament's Fungi Perfecti had just republished Miriam's book, The Mushrooms for Color. No, it's The Mushrooms for Dyes, Paper, Pigments, and Mycosticks. And Miriam, in 1968, you know, she was an artist and an educator, and she was teaching kids about natural dyes at the Mendocino Art Center. And she was asked by some people in her community to go on a foray, and that kind of piqued her interest. So she thought she'd go. And she saw these bright, kind of yellowish mushrooms, these sulfur tufts, the Hypholoma mascularia, or fascularia, sorry. And she cooked them up, and voila, a lemony yellow was produced on the fibers. And so that started Miriam doing all kinds of experiments, research, and studies in the 70s. And she published this book, Mushroom for Color, that is out of print at this point. She started the International Mushroom Dye Institute, which is a nonprofit that continues today. That is being run by her daughter, Felicia here. And as part of the IMDI, Miriam started the International Fungi and Fiber Symposium with some colleagues in Sweden. And they started that in 1980, and they'd meet every couple years as a way to get together, do experiments, research, and kind of share knowledge of what they're learning. And I'm really excited because the Fungi and Fiber Symposium is going to be hosted in my home state this year in Port Townsend, Washington this fall. So that's going to be exciting time. So I am going to see if I can demo. I think I'm going to have to stop sharing the Mushroom Color Atlas. Go over to the screen. So this is the Mushroom Color. Oops, I have to start sharing the screen again. What happened? Sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Back to Zoom, screen share. There we go. Now you can see. Hopefully you can all see the Mushroom Color Atlas now on your screen. So this is the Mushroom Color Atlas. It's got over 600 swatches of color and pigments, dyes that's been produced from mushrooms. And you can see I'm kind of scrolling through it here. And as I click above, it highlights different mushrooms. You can see there, I'll click on Hidnellum regium, one of my favorites. You can zoom in on the illustration to see a high-res version of that. You can click through the different fiber swatches, as well as the pigment swatches to see high-res. And this talks here, as I roll over, about the fiber type that's used, the mordant. I've got different notes here about how things were done. And then I sometimes have stories of myco peeps, of people in the community that I was out with, in this case with Michael Bugh, when we found Hidnellum regium, which supposedly people had not found until we found it together in our area. It wasn't known to grow down here. So that was a super exciting discovery that we had. Whenever you go out with Michael Bugh, he always discovers some new variety of mushroom. So you can also go through the Mushroom Color Atlas And you could click. So for example, look at just the types of colors from tooth fungus or from guild mushrooms. And it'll narrow down. You could also say, I just want to see all of the pigment, the paint created from these, or just the dyes for the fabric. So that gives a little sense of it. And then there's an index. I've organized the index by mushroom type to help people who might not know a lot about how to identify mushrooms. They might not know the keying mechanisms and the taxonomy. They can go in and kind of understand based on the type of mushroom that it is. So here we've got like a guild mushroom, Cortinarius neosanguinus. Cortinarius are great for producing reds. These specifically the Cortinarius in the Thermostabies family. But you can see this range of color. You get these incredible, brilliant reds, and with some iron, you get purple. And this is when you modify the dye bath, which I'll talk about in a little bit, where we're changing it to be a more alkaline dye bath. Versus when we don't make that change, you can see some of the corals and pinks that it creates. There's also a section outlining the process. So anyone who's new to mushroom dyes or who has been working with it a long time can come here and learn kind of the basic process of how to do this. And I applied very specific parameters for all the samples here. And then there's an about section that gives some different online resources and different books and so forth that you can look at. So I'm gonna stop sharing that, go back, hold on, get my Zoom, share my screen. For some reason, my Zoom wants to keep going into the background there. So in working on the Mushroom Color Atlas, this is a little bit of background. I created different experience like user maps and diagrams here, these black and white, of thinking how this would work, what the user experience would be. And my husband was the designer. He and I had the design studio together, and he was looking at the visuals of what that could be. And then we were thinking a lot about the mushrooms. How are we going to represent the mushrooms? Should they be photographs? Should they be colored illustrations? Should they be black and white? And we really wanted to make sure that the colors from the mushrooms were front and center. So black and white illustrations, and I went on Instagram to look for different illustrators, found a handful of them, and connected with Julie Gates, who is in the UK, an amazing illustrator. And, you know, this was March. I kind of conceived of the idea in March of 2021. So this might have been late spring, early summer. I connected with Julie. And Julie was a healthcare worker over in the UK and had just been through, you know, these horrendous experiences with COVID. And she'd work these incredibly long shifts, and then she'd get a chunk of days off. And she's like, nothing would be more wonderful than to just sit and draw these dye mushrooms. So that's what she did. And it was fantastic. And then I worked with a former collaborator and colleague, Danny Rosenberg, who did the programming. So the four of us kind of all came together to create this Mushroom Color Atlas. So a lot of you, since you're in the Mushroom Club of Georgia, you know a lot about mushrooms. One thing I love to point out to people is that often the dye mushrooms don't look like our typical mushroom, right? You know, with that stalk and a cap with gills, it's kind of the classic, what you think of as a mushroom. And you have Julie's illustrations here on the right, and it's the whole gamut. You know, clearly we do have some of the classic guild mushrooms with Cortinarius Thermostabies, but we've got lots of polypores, lots of tooth fungi, lots of boletes, puffballs, you name it. So it's really exciting. I wanted to go through the different types of mushrooms and look at these. Boletes are great dyers. Everyone always is like, oh my gosh, how can you dye with, a porcini or a certain type of bolete that they love. And I always love to explain to everyone that for dye mushrooms, we want them when they're a little more mature. So at that point in time, they're going to have a lot of color, and they're going to have a lot of worms and a lot of slime and a lot of disgustingness. So no one's going to want to eat it. So this picture of this porcini I love because I had a perfect dye mushroom and I had a perfect edible all in one. And when we think about where the color is in these mushrooms, they're stored in different areas. And with boletes, it's all in the sponge. And so that is why, you know, those pores under the cap. And that is why we want them to be more mature, because look at all the color in those. And so you can do different preparation to get these range of really beautiful kind of olive greenies and oranges and yellows. When we look at coral fungi, that is a great dyer. And one of the things I love about having this mushroom color atlas is if you come across some Romaria and you think, oh, I want to work with this, you know, if you work with it with just some alum mordant or whatever, you're going to just get the beigey yellow. Now, there's nothing wrong with that color, but it's not nearly as exciting as if you work with this mushroom with some iron. You get these beautiful purple grays. So my hope is as people are out looking and foraging and thinking about what they want to do, they're able to use the mushroom color atlas to help learn and achieve maybe some colors that are of interest to them. And you can see here, the coral fungi that the Romaria that I collect is in the fall. We've got lots of different varieties in my area growing in the fall and that have a variety of colors. And I just put all the different varieties into one pot. And I love when I'm working with the young kids at the elementary school or something, we do a magic trick where we put the fiber in. It's like, oh, we pull it out and it's like, well, there's not really any color. That it kind of looks the same color as when we put it in. And then I have a little pot of iron that's a modifier, and I dip the fabric in there and they instantly see the magic trick of turning this purple color. So it's a really fun mushroom, easy to work with. Fall skilled mushrooms, the blue chanterelle. I know it's an edible. It's actually not one of my most favorite edibles. And the colors it produces are just out of this world. So I, of course, dye with this mushroom. When they're young, I tend to protect their little environment. So hopefully no one else comes upon them, and I wait until they're a little older and have a little more color in them and mature to dye them. And then we've got the Cortinarius Thermostabies. Again, this is, you know, the Neosanguinus, amazing colors. These are small mushrooms. You can see, you know, I've got a couple of bigger ones in my hand. I've got a couple of smaller ones. And we'll talk about the weight of the mushrooms, like how many mushrooms do you really need to dye, say, a skein of yarn or something? And I'll talk about that. With the quartz, because they are so small, you end up, you know, it took me a couple seasons to be able to collect enough quartz, you know, to dye some yardage of fabric, because you need a lot of them. There they are, these little cuties. And then we've got the Polypore family. Polypore family has lots of dye mushrooms in it. This is the famed Phaeola schwetzenites, the Dyer's Polypore. And these are just some of the colors it produces here. It produces up to 4 very different colors with the greens, orange, yellows, and the red rust browns. And this is a Polypore that, or a Phaeolus that's in perfect condition for dyeing. It's a little more mature, but it still has kind of the light yellow edge around it. And it's got a lot of color in it. And you can see all the color that's there. I will sometimes find them in what I call the bread loaf stage, which is what this image is, where they're tiny and they're kind of like little, it's like a fresh, you know, loaf of bread, and it's all squishy and gooey. And I will wait because these are so young and they do have color in them, but it hasn't matured. So I often will wait to pick that. And then we've got puffballs. This is the Dyer's puffball, Isolithos. I mean, just look at that. You can see the color inside that puffball, and these golden browns are just beautiful. And then we've got some of my favorite fungi, the tooth fungi. These create incredible ranges of blues and greens. They are a little more finicky to work with. You have to adjust the dye bath to be a pH 9 in order to get these colors. if you don't do that adjustment early on, you're not going to achieve these colors, but they're just spectacular. And I mean, these are just the jewels of the forest floor for me, seeing them. And, you know, the blue chanterelle, it's like a flower growing down there. And so this is hidden Ellum Cerelium, and you can see the vegetation around the edges there. And this is a great specimen at a nice age to harvest. So one of the things I had been thinking about after seeing an exhibit at the Somerset House in the UK, it was all dedicated towards fungi. And Jonathan Reiki, who's the director there, he said, mushrooms may be rooted in history, but our interaction with them is all about channeling human creativity in new and unexpected ways. And I think that is so true, because everything that can be accomplished with fungi and mycelium and mushrooms, and then you look at the color and the power of creativity and innovation that can come from that is super exciting. So Sam, I'm going to have you spotlight my overhead, and I am going to jump to that and show you some of the mushrooms and some of the colors that I've gotten. So is it spotlighted? I can't tell from wherever I am. It's good to go. Okay, there we go. So let's see. I'm going to try to hold this up nice and center, bring it up for you guys to see. So this is that Dyer's Polypore, Phaeolus schwetzenitzii. And these are all dried. I do dry my mushrooms because I don't have room in my freezer. It's filled with other things. And as I'm drying them, obviously the water content is dissipating. So I'll talk a little bit about if you're working with fresh mushrooms versus dried mushrooms, being able to weigh them. But you can see this color in this mushroom here. And it's just, I mean, as you pop that and break it open. And then up here, you can see all the different colors it produces, this array on
Julie,
wool, silk, and linen. Yeah.
the spotlight, it's not on the main screen. It's on a.
It's not. Let's see. I stop
Now,
sharing.
now it is.
Okay. I
Okay.
was still sharing. I forgot to stop. Okay.
Okay,
Can
there
you
we
guys
go.
see these? Okay.
That's great.
So these are the array of colors on the different fabric and fiber. And then you compare that to the array of pigments that it produces. So these pigments are all watercolor paint swatches that I've done. And as we work our way around, this is one of my favorite specimens here. This is Econodontium Tintorium. And you guys all know what's growing up through here, but this is the mycelium. Just super exciting. This is a tooth fungi. And I don't know if you can see the teeth here. These grow super high up in like Douglas fir trees and so forth. So let me move it this way. There we go. So we only find these after like windstorms have knocked trees down, or if the mushroom has fallen down. They're like wood, and they're pretty impressive. A lot of people will pass by them thinking that it's just a piece of wood that has fallen. And these are the colors again. So it's that Indian paint fungus, and then some of the range on the fibers. So to me, it makes a much more exciting pigment than it actually does a dye. This is a mushroom that I didn't talk about earlier, but this is the lobster mushroom, Hypomyces lactiforium. And this is a small little specimen here. Again, another edible. But by the time we want to dye with this guy, they are rotten, slimy, and stinky, because we want all the color we can get. You can see this range of pinks and reds that you can get with this mushroom, that the pigments and that the dyes here. These are incredible dyers. And they're also, a favorite edible as well. So sometimes I'll tell friends who are going out getting them for edibles, if you find any rotten ones, bring them back for me. And some are like, they were so rotten and disgusting, we couldn't even bring them. And I'm like, oh, they would have been perfect dye specimens, but they are stinky. So this is the Dyer's Polypore, Isolithos. You can see in here, it's got a little mold growing on it, nice and dry, but just lots and lots of color in this mushroom. This actually, mushroom is very hard to transform into a pigment. It makes a beautiful ink. And there is a difference between an ink and a pigment in that the ink is just a concentrated dye bath, versus a pigment has, it's been soluble and it has become insoluble. So this one, because of the spores and the makeup of that mushroom, are really hard, but these are the range of colors that are just spectacular. And then we get to our Cortinarius. So this is neosanguinus, so you can see the size difference, and once they dry, they get obviously even tinier. And these mushrooms, they pack a punch. So another thing we think about when we're dyeing with mushrooms is how much mushroom do I need? How do I weigh that? But also, we've got this rule of thumb in natural dyes that we say, hey, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So if your fiber that you want to dye, say, weighs 100 grams, well, then you need 100 grams of mushroom. Well, 100 grams of dried Cortinarius, you're going to need a pretty big pile of it. The cool thing is, though, is that the Cortinarius are so full of color that you really only need half or a third of that to get these color ranges. And it's the same with Phaeolus. You only need like half the amount. So I'd only need 50 grams. Here are these pigment colors that are just amazing and wonderful. Now, these pigments have modifiers on them. So we've got the base color here, and then we've modified them with different, whether it's an acid, an alky, copper, iron, etc., to get these range of colors. Another Cortinarius, this is Cortinarius crucifolius that grows in my community, and you can see this is like an orangish colored mushroom. So it's a Dermostaby, it's a Dyer, and it creates these beautiful shades of oranges and corals. Now, what's interesting is when you transform it into a pigment, you start to get these reds, but you're not really able, or at least I haven't been able to get those range of reds through a dye, but it's a great, color shift as a pigment. This is that Hypomyces regium that I showed you. This was a huge one here, and you can see the teeth under there and all the color, and just these deep, dark blue, blacks and greens, and these ranges, and even, on cellulose fiber, linen, and then this beautiful range of pigments that you can get with the different modifiers and such. I just love tooth fungi, or some are my favorite. This is Ellum Oronticantium, and you can see here they have little specimens, but you can see the blue down in there. And this was actually probably 5 times the size when I harvested it. It was probably at least this big around, and it all just shrunk down as the water came out. So they're just beautiful specimens here. And so you can see the color, and there's a range of these different types of Hypomyces. These are making these kind of light blues and darker blue greens, and same, got some pigment here with some copper added, but the pigments aren't nearly as intense or strong as the dyes. And now we've got Hidnellum Cerelium. This is actually the specimen that was in the photo. You can see the little divots where the guttation was there in that one. And again, the blues, beautiful. I mean, the teeth are a shade of blue. They're just incredible. And this, compared to Hidnellum Oronticum, produces darker shades of blues and more variety. And then the pigment is also stronger. in terms of its coloration. So that's kind of a whole range of different types of mushrooms that you can see produce, you know, all these ranges of colors. So we'll now hop back and we can unspotlight that, and I will go back to share my screen. Get that full screen there. So we've just taken a tour of dye mushrooms. And when we think about foraging, you know, I probably don't need to explain this to a mushroom club, but to those that are new to it, you always want to make sure that you have the proper permits in place, that you're not trespassing on private land, that you're ethically foraging, which in my mind means take only what you need or take only a small amount. So for every mushroom that I forage for a dye mushroom, I leave a few behind, because this is just my perspective and point of view. There's no right or wrong. But from my point of view, if I'm able to leave a few behind, it just helps to kind of ensure that things go through, you know, they go through the sporulation process, etc. And I just feel that it's a gift, returning it back to the land rather than taking every single one I find. I also try to disturb the habitat as little as possible. With some of these fungi, if they're wow, I need a drink of water here. Sorry. With some of the fungi, disturbing the mycelium isn't going to impact the fungi, depending on the type that it is. For others, it does kind of create a disturbance. So I'm always very careful. And if I'm going to create a big, you know, pulling up like a giant Dyer's Polypore, I'm just going to cut down around and try to leave as much of the soil and everything intact as possible. And again, that's my personal approach to it, of kind of being ethical, only taking what you need and not disturbing the habitat significantly. You guys all know you can touch any mushroom, even poisonous ones. You just don't want to ingest them. There are lots of dye mushrooms that are not edible in any way, shape, or form. So you definitely don't want to, you know, put anything in your mouth. But there are some dye mushrooms that are edible. So it just depends. And when we talk about the parts used, when I talked about the boletes and the color being in the cap, like in the sponge, and we don't use the stalk or the stipe, there's no color in it. Now, when we look at the Cortinarius mushrooms, you saw those were filled with color, right? The cap and the stalk, they were both red or orange, but the concentration of color is actually in the cap itself. And so when people find Cortinarius, they will often separate the cap from the stalk, and they will, you know, be very purist about it and just dye with caps. I, however, don't take the time to do that. And I tend to throw it all in, and I'm happy with the color and results I get. But if I were to throw, you know, all the stem and so forth of a porcini, it would start to like dilute the dye bath, because there's no color in that. And it's the same thing with lobster mushroom, Hypomyces lactiforium. The color only exists in the outer edge, right along, it's the red color. And so in that case, I actually do peel my lobster mushrooms, because that white center, it doesn't have any value. I don't know that it technically starts to dilute the dye bath, but it hogs up space in the dye pot. And so then you have less room for your fiber and everything to move around. So I'll peel those. Sometimes if I'm lazy, I won't. But we just want to think about and know all the different parts that we're using for the mushroom to make sure that we're getting all the color. I talked about using mine dried. I put them in a dehydrator and dry them out, just like you might do that with edible mushrooms. Very similar. Now, with dye mushrooms, have a dedicated dehydrator. You do not want to dehydrate edible mushrooms in it, or fruit, or anything else, because there'll be little bits and parts that will, you know, come out, and you don't want to eat those. You can work with them frozen. I personally don't, because I don't have room to freeze a bunch of dye mushrooms in my freezer. I do sometimes freeze the leftover, what I call the mash, because so for example, with the Cortinarius, if I know I haven't cooked them and exhausted that dye bath, there's more color in them and they're so hard to come by, I save every little scrap. So I will freeze, you know, after I've cooked them up, I throw them in the freezer. Freezing can kill extra bugs or moths and stuff, but because we're not eating them, dehydrating them tends to be fine. And then I store them sealed up and everything. The other thing I talked about with the mushrooms is the idea of the weight of the goods. So the goods are the actual mushrooms, and then the weight of the fiber. And the fiber is whatever it is you're putting into your dye pot. And we automatically do a 1-to-1 ratio to make sure that we're going to get good color. But if you look at the mushroom color atlas, I talk about those ratios so that you know, hey, I maybe don't need as much mushroom. And I'm going to create this whole pot of these and only put in a small amount of fiber. I'm going to have a lot left over, like Haplophilus rigilans. That's so potent. It's like 1 to 5. It's just amazing.
Julie, which mushroom was that again?
Haplophilus. So that creates the famed purple. It actually doesn't grow in my area.
Right.
But it does grow by you guys in the Northeast and
the Midwest.
the South. So yeah. So you want to think about that. And then the last thing, and I in particular about a couple of things, that doesn't mean that you need to be, because like everything in life, there's no real right way or wrong way. But after all this effort of, foraging, identification, processing, preparing, storing, I want to make sure that I use every bit of surface area I can of these mushrooms. So I actually grind my mushrooms in a coffee grinder. Now, a lot of people don't do that. They'll just chop them into small little pieces and so forth. But I've found I just can get more color and more intensity of the color if I'm able to grind it and get a little more surface exposure. Now, when I'm grinding my mushrooms, it's in a coffee grinder that I never use for coffee or for any other kind of thing I'm going to eat. It's just dedicated to dye mushrooms, and I'm wearing a mask. So I was wearing masks before COVID because you don't want all those fine particles, just infiltrating your whatever system. So that's it on mushrooms. And now when you're working with natural dyes of any sort, they prefer natural fibers. So synthetic fibers tend not to work well with natural dyes, whether they're mushrooms or plants or flowers, those sorts of things. So we're working with protein fibers that are wool and silk, or cellulose fibers like linen, cotton, hemp, bamboo, etc. And you're going to want to scour your fibers. So this is super important. We call it scouring in the natural dye world, but it's basically wash your fibers. For any kind of cellulose fiber, I just wash them in my washing machine. If I'm working with certain silks or wools, I actually do them in a pot on my, little dye burner, because I want to be very controlling of them, because I don't want to felt my wools or strip my silks and those sorts of things. But it is important. If you're out shopping for fiber, sometimes they'll say, oh, it's prepared for dyeing, right? PFD. And it is. But there still could be some remnants from the manufacturing process that keep the dyes from kind of seamlessly binding. And you can get, if you don't clean them, you can get kind of these streaks and so forth. So it's always a good rule of thumb to scour your fibers. And then you need to mordant them, like I talked about. For the mushroom color atlas, to get this array of colors, I'm working with different fiber types and different mordants. And that's what yields the different colorations, the different colorways. If you don't mordant your fibers, your dye is not going to fix to the fiber, and over time it's going to wash out or fade out. But there are some mushrooms, like I talked about, that are natural accumulators of mordants. And Phaeolus schwetzenites, Dyer's Polypore, is one of them. You don't have to mordant your fiber to work with that mushroom. That's why it's just like the best beginner's dye mushroom. It also grows in all kinds of habitats because, you know, it's basically a white rot mushroom. So you could go to campgrounds where people have cut down trees and you're going to see that mushroom fruiting because it's in the process of decomposing those stumps or what have you. Now, if you don't mordant your fiber, you're going to get a range of yellows that are really beautiful. But let's say you want an olive green, well, then you're going to need to use iron. Or let's say you want to get a really bright orange, you're going to need to use tin. So depending on which colors you're going for with Phaeolus, you might need to use a mordant. But technically speaking, it will fix without a mordant. So, and there's other mushrooms like that as well. When you're dyeing with the mushroom, you're making a dye, and I equate it to the equivalent of making a cup of tea. You're basically steeping in warm water the mushrooms to coax the color out of them. And that's as simple as it gets. And Phaeolus is super easy to work with. Phaeolus doesn't mind if you forget about it and you bring it to a roaring boil. It's a true, you know, tried and true, can withstand anything. But there are other mushrooms like the Cortinarius family that doesn't like to get really hot. And if you make it too hot, you can do what we call, you zap the color or beige the color out. So again, in the Mushroom Color Atlas, I talk about kind of the temperature ranges of where I'm going with this. Lots of people like to do solar dyeing with some of these mushrooms, but you don't realize, like, oh, I'm just going to leave it out in the sun for a couple of hours. And before you know it, you've basically brought that to such an intense heat that you've zapped the color out of it. So you can definitely do solar dyes with a variety of different mushrooms. You just have to be careful and keep an eye on it. So one of the other things I'm particular about is my temperature. And I have a little like infrared temperature thing that I use to get really accurate temperatures. Because again, if I'm going to go to all this trouble, I don't want to get it too hot and zap it. And I don't want to cook it too low, because then I'm just like, I'm not getting the color out, and I'm not getting the color out, and I'm overcooking it. So when you make these dye baths, you can then do what's called immersion dyeing. You can immerse your fibers in it. But then you can take that dye bath, because you'll notice it still has a bunch of color in it. It's not clear liquid. And you can then transform that into a pigment. So you're taking that soluble dye bath and you're making an insoluble pigment. And you do that through a process called laking. And laking is another French term that sounds a little strange. If you talk to people like, oh, I'm going to make a lake today. What are you talking about? You're going to make a lake. But that's basically a process that I outlined on the site, where you take that dye bath and you're adding different mineral to it, and you're modifying the pH of it. So you're adding alum, and that alum kind of creates these much larger molecules for the dye to affix to. And then you modify it with an alkaline like soda ash, and you're adjusting the pH of it. And then the alky applies to the molecules of the alum, and they all glob on, and they get super heavy, and they sink to the bottom. And then you go through the process of levigating that pigment, straining it out, drying it, etc. And then the other thing I talked about was ink. Some mushrooms, they don't, the pigment process just doesn't work well for them by the nature of the structure of the mushroom itself. And Isolithos is one of those. If you concentrate down your dye bath by, heating it up and cooking it down to a concentrate, you can make ink. So that is kind of the different types of things you can get from this. I also like to pre-soak my mushrooms often. I'll stick them in one of my jars or my pots and let them just kind of soak in that water and get absorbed. And if I am grinding my mushrooms, which is what I always do, you can kind of see in these pictures the ground up bags that are in there. I will then strain out the mushroom before I put the fabric or the fiber in. And that's because if you don't, you could end up with a million little particles that you will forever be picking out of your fiber. So I always strain them. And that's because I grind them. If you're using bigger chunks, you could put your fiber directly in with those bigger chunks. But I am saving that the mash of those mushrooms, and then I will recook it, because there's this concept in natural dyes that we talk about exhaust baths. So the first dye bath you cook up and you put your fiber in is going to be the most like vibrant and I can't think of the word. Anyways, it's going to be the strongest. And then you take that out and you say, okay, now I'm going to put a little more fiber in. You've exhausted that bath a second time. You're still going to get lots of color, but it might be lighter or not as intense. You exhaust it out for a third time. So I save my mash and I'll recook it and exhaust it until I don't get any color out of it. So and then I freeze those, because otherwise there's no way for me to dry them and they'll get all gross and moldy. So I just throw the little mash, and it's tiny by then. I just throw it in the freezer. So I talked about making the lakes. This is the process. You can see there, I'm on the left, all that colorful liquid and that pigment up at the top, that's eventually going to fall to the bottom and settle down. And then I'm going to pour off the supernatant, and then I'm going to strain it out. I use these super big coffee filters for straining it. And then I've got this dried pigment. And then I'm making paint. So just like the dyes, how we need to mordant our fiber, you need to put a binder in when you make your paint. And that binder is then what lets it affix to whatever surface. So for the Mushroom Color Atlas, I made watercolor paint. So I'm using gum arabic. I also used gum arabic in the ink because I'm applying it to paper, and it worked well. When I apply it to fiber, fabric for some of my own work, I'm using gum tragacanth. When I'm doing things for my partner, I might make a cassine out of it, or I might make oil paint. You can make tempera. You can do all kinds of things. I mean, basically, you have a pigment that you can do anything with. So that's super exciting. And as I kind of think about the future of looking at using mushrooms for color, I get super excited. I have 9 more mushrooms to add to the Mushroom Color Atlas, so it's ongoing and starting to travel into different areas and regions and zones. I'm going to teach next year at the John C. Campbell Folk School, so collect specimens from those areas, add them to the Mushroom Color Atlas, and thinking about like new products and what's possible. You know, you've got companies like MycoWorks and others that are making mycelium leather. You've got designers that are looking to these color palettes to inform their own design work from the Mushroom Color Atlas. Where I live, the headquarters of Nike are close by. So I hosted the 15 color designers from Nike that are responsible for all color for the whole company to come out. We did a forage. We then went into the studio and we worked with the fibers, and it was inspiring them, thinking about they had been taxed with the sorry, my throat, with thinking about the future, the next 50 years of color for Nike. So it was super exciting to think that they're looking to the mycological world. Of course, a dream would be that we start to cultivate dye mushrooms the way we do edibles. But sorry, I'm gonna cough here. Okay, hopefully I'll spared you from my cough. Sorry, I'm getting too excited. My voice can't keep up. So yeah, so thank you everyone for this amazing opportunity and for the invitation to present and for all of you joining tonight. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, conversation, whatever you would like to talk about.
Thank you, Julie. That's so interesting. And it's so cool that you got to meet with color designers at Nike. That's
I know,
amazing.
It's fascinating.
We have a couple of questions that are in the chat already, and then we can also let people unmute and do some questions. And
okay, let's see.
It's great. I got to ask. So we have.
Oh, I see someone talking about Siri's work
right
at Oregon State. Yes,
that's right. We introduced you to each other.
Asphalting.
Yes.
Yeah. The work they are doing there is just amazing. And they've published books on it. I've got the book and I'm hoping to collaborate and bring those colors into the Mushroom Color Atlas. And interestingly enough, those colors and dyes tend to work best on synthetic fibers.
Right.
So that was really interesting to learn.
Right. That is cool. So let's see, I could probably help with you've been talking a lot and you're excited, I understand. So
well, I'm choking to death over here. Sorry. But yes, if you
what month are you going to be teaching at the folk school?
In September. I think the third week in September.
I think there's a big Echinonotus hispidus that comes out every year. So I think that might be the right month for you, actually. So
that's what I was hoping, and working with them, we were trying to figure that all out. So,
right.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
So
okay.
Let me help you out. I can go back through and get retrieve some of these questions. And
great.
Let's see. I asked you what kind of tree Econodontium Tintorium grows on. I think you said Doug fir.
Douglas fir, yeah.
Okay. All right.
A fake fir.
And then I also am curious when the International Fungi and Fiber Symposium in the next 2 years, which country will it be in? Do you know? Because it's usually every 2 years.
Alyssa Allen is the host for this US one. She's the US representative for IFS. And she's part of a group, and they'll have a meeting at the symposium to identify the next host country, and they'll announce it on the last day.
Okay. So Michael
yeah.
Fletcher would be the question that's up next. And Michael, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, it's sort of a question about, well, sort of two mediums. Like one is the fabrics and the other is like artist pigments for using like you mentioned, cassine or watercolors. So
yep.
So the main part of that, my thing that you hadn't really mentioned yet, I don't think, is like how color fast or light fast or archival are these pigments on like paper mediums or dyes and fabrics?
Yeah. So, with all natural dyes, these have been used throughout time and history. Some are going to fade a little more quickly than others, and others are incredibly light fast. So I have a serious tickle in my throat. I have no idea what's going on. Sorry about that. So it really just depends on the mushroom. Mushrooms that tend to be accumulators of the mordants tend to be more light fast. But like everything in the natural dye world, it may slightly fade over time. but some of them do hold up, archival. I was just in a museum and was seeing tapestries from 1735 that were using blues and reds that were as brilliant. I just couldn't even believe it. It's like they hold up to all the synthetics. They were so vibrant. It was incredible. But some mushrooms are not as dye fast or as light fast. So I'm hoping to do studies with these swatches where I expose them, to direct sunlight for a month or two, or see what happens and show the variation. That's something I'm hoping to add someday. So
I would say at least the pieces that I have been very light fast. Pieces that I have from other people that have done it.
yeah, they are. And it also gets into how you finish it with the fiber and so forth as well.
Right. And then the next question is about the poison in the mushrooms getting into the fabric. Michael, was that all your question? I didn't.
But maybe she could, since she mentioned it, maybe she could touch on like how you might finish either like a painted, like a watercolor and or a fabric.
Well, with the like paper-based and stuff, it's fine the way it is. Some people will treat their canvases with different things, and that will help add light fastness, whether it's beeswax or what have you. With the fiber itself, you need to wash it and take it through a process of bringing the temperature up. So for cellulose fibers, you can actually bring them to a boil for like 10 minutes. And what that does is it swells the fibers and lets the dye grab into those fibers, and then also allows any excess dye to kind of be released. With wool and silk, you don't want to bring them up to a rapid boil. You'd bring them up to like 160 or 140 degrees, depending. But you do that and put some soap in there, and then you finished off those fibers. A lot of times people skip that process at the end of finishing them off. But if you do finish them off, that helps improve the light fastness of them.
So you said, I'm sorry.
Does a vinegar or any kind of alkali, does like a pH solution or anything necessary?
No, with indigo it is, because it's a high alkaline environment. Now with tooth fungi, we're also in a high alkaline environment, but you will shift the color if you put an acid in, like a vinegar. So it doesn't need it for light fastness. I've never put any kind of basically what you're doing is by adding an acid, you're taking something that was alkaline and you're neutralizing it. And I've never needed to do that with the dye mushrooms, but they respond to the acid differently. But for example, with indigo, you definitely need to do that because it's just a super high, we're at a pH 13 type thing.
So you can kind of just consult this, your website, the color chart, and it'll get, it's like a database, right? It's just the answers are probably there. Thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Julie, partly also to give you a little bit of a break, but Carmen Beggs is on here, and we've done a workshop with John Marshall, who does indigo and Japanese textiles. And he taught us this thing where you take soybeans and then you soak them and soybean milk, basically homemade soybean milk, and then you soak the fabric in it. And it stops it from crocking. So crocking is when the dye comes off of the fabric.
Right.
Every time you rinse it, you get dye, or when you wear it, you get dye on your skin. Stops it from crocking. It acts like a Scotch guard, and it's just soybeans and water. And it worked fabulously on a couple tie-dyed t-shirts that I had that were done in Indonesia.
Yeah, and I've done it, like the piece behind me, I do the soy milk rinse after. That's another way to finish off the fabric, to kind of apply that sealer, similar to people who might apply beeswax to a canvas or something. And that's definitely a way to go. I do that after the fact, and I do it, you know how John teaches you, you don't want, making the soy milk is specific so that you don't make your fabric or your fiber stiff
Right.
afterwards. Now you can also use soy as a mordant, and people will use that on cellulose fibers to, in essence, trick that cellulose into being a protein, and then you'll get different color ranges. So I didn't use soy in the Mushroom Color Atlas as a mordant, just because of time. But yeah, for different projects, I'll finish with soy. So that is a good point. I had forgotten about that with the soy. But yes, John, I love John. He's the best.
And this might actually answer some of what the next question is about, whether there's any concern about the mushroom fabric getting in the mouths of children, for instance. Like, is there anything in the dye that could harm them? We happen
not that I'm aware of, because you basically, you know, cooked it out. I'm not aware of any extensive, but that would be a good question for a mycologist. I should ask Michael Bug.
who's in charge of
We've talked a lot
toxicology.
about this and a lot of the different chemical compounds, and he has never brought that up. But there could be a mushroom out there. I don't know. But in general, no, I'm not aware of any issues like that, because the toxins are not being captured in that.
So, and Kel has a question about making sumi ink sticks with the pigments. So those are using Japanese and Asian brush painting.
Yep.
Have you
I
tried that?
I have not made the sumi ink sticks with them. It would be interesting to try that. I've made the myco sticks, you know, which are in essence a type of like crayon, for lack of a better description. But yeah, I bet they would lend themselves well to that. That would be a fun thing to experiment and see.
Yeah, I haven't. What's the binder for the myco sticks then? Is it a wax?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, beeswax.
All right. And then there's another question about how permanent are the dyes. You kind of talked about that with Michael a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah, the
question
hide
about
glue for the sumi. Yeah.
how old is too old for these mushrooms?
Well, it's never too old. It's just basically what you want to deal with. How much like rot, slime, stink, grossness. You know.
What's your gross factor?
The other thing with John, we made some sumi and we didn't use hide glue. We used a glue from a fish.
Ooh.
It's not the puffer, I forget the name of it, Nazazawa or something. And that had some really interesting results.
Wow.
So
Okay.
yeah. He sent us little packets of things to try, and that was one of them.
Cool.
So he sells it. I don't know where else you'd get it other than through him, but
It sounds awesome.
yeah. It's some fish glue.
All right. So if there are other people that have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask. And then we can see your face. That'd be great too. So.
Cool. And Kel, you said that the fish glue is less water soluble for primitive tools. Yeah, that makes sense. Anyways, it was fun to experiment with and try. Any other questions?
I had one question. Do you know if anybody from Estonia is coming to this conference?
Yes, I believe.
Okay. Because Susan Hopkins
So,
told me there are women from Estonia that brought
Yeah.
Hapalopolis mycelium. You can dye
Yeah.
with the mycelium. So
Yeah, I heard about that. They had a IFS in Estonia. I'm pretty sure the one woman is coming. And we've got someone else from Latvia coming as well.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Michael had a question.
Well, I was just going to comment that you were talking about the fish glue at a long time ago when I was in college and art school, and we made we used rabbit skin glue to gesso canvases with, like the way the old masters did. And oh my God, that stuff stink.
I know. So my husband uses that in his work all the time, this rabbit skin glue that and he'll laugh because we share a studio together, and I'll be cooking up some mushrooms. He's like, oh my God, those things stink. You got to get it out of here. Go outside. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I just brought the pot in. I didn't realize it smelled. And I was like, but come on, your rabbit skin glue reeks. And you're always working with it in here. And he's like, it does. So we always joke back and forth about our stinky processes.
And also there's this book I just happened to take out of the library early this week. It's called Natural Kitchen Dyes, and by this woman, Alicia Hall, and a lot of what you covered, she does mushrooms too, but not very much.
Great.
Mostly she does things like it's herbs, teas, and fruits and vegetables, and like hibiscus and carrots and all sorts of other things.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Various.
Oh, interesting. I'll check it out.
Yeah, it's got some great pictures in it. It's very easy reading, but it just came out. The library just got it last month. So anyway.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. Your talk's been great.
Yeah. Thank you guys for joining. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Sam? Was that a
Just as an aside, Julie, if you will send me you have a PayPal account, I assume?
Yeah.
Could you just send me that info?
glitched out again, dear. So you're asking her if she has a PayPal account.
Yeah, just send me the info, please.
I have a PayPal.
Okay.
Happy
I'm done
to
glitching.
do that.
Can you just talk a little bit more about making the lakes? Like you said that there was a word you used that started with an L and had G something in lev something.
Levigating.
Levigating.
Yeah. So, you're basically taking your dye bath and you're adding alum and soda ash according to a certain process and a certain ratio, which I've got on the website. And as you add that, you're trying to capture all that color in the dye bath so that as these molecules that have now gotten enlarged and heavy, they're going to drop to the bottom. And then everything up above that should be clear liquid because you've captured all the color. And then that liquid up above it is called the supernatant. And you just kind of decant that. You pour that off. And then you get to where all the pigment and the color is. And you want to strain that out so that you get all the liquid out of it. And I use different like coffee strainers and stuff to strain that out and then dry the pigment. So that's the laking process. It's super simple process. You've got to do some experiments, especially with different mushrooms. Sometimes you have to adjust the ratio of how much alum and soda ash to add, just to make sure you can capture all of the color. And then some mushrooms, they just don't respond to those minerals in a way because of the makeup of the mushroom, like these puff balls. They just don't, you can't, the alum and the soda ash, they don't bind with that pigment. And so they basically, you make inks out of them, which is perfectly fine. And works great, but you don't end up getting a pigment. So it'd be hard to, make oil paint out of it or something like that because you don't have a pigment. But
Okay. Thank you for explaining that further.
yeah.
All right.
Any other? Well, thanks everyone. This has been great fun. I love talking to other mycophiles. So hopefully the rains that you've been getting the last few days bring some good little treasures, and maybe you'll find some dye mushrooms out there.
Well, I appreciate you talking about boletes being a good source of color, because everyone I've talked to has said, no, you can't. And that actually brings me to, some of the boletes are beautiful shades of orange and yellow, really bright colors. Does any of that translate into the dye pot at all, or?
Yes.
Okay.
I enjoy working with boletes. You get good range of yellows, orange, greens. The trick with boletes is you want to put a glug of vinegar in. The vinegar acts as a solvent, as a way to kind of coax the color out. And it's also going to make brighter colors. So you're going to get, depending on what you like, I like the brighter ones in this case. So I use that a lot. I do have friends that are like, I'm not going to use any boletes. They're just these muddy, beigey, uninteresting colors. And I was like, well, they do produce that, but throw in some vinegar, watch your temperature, don't get it too hot. And then they'll be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This is so great. So kind of all these little tricks, like sometimes you'll hear different things. People talk about how tooth fungi will fade quickly and not hold their color. And yeah, that can happen. It just depends on how you prepared the dye. Like talking with Susan Hopkins and stuff, it's like really cooking it and letting it soak. I like to soak my tooth fungi ahead of time, kind of let them ferment and rot. Other people don't. It's all fine. You might just get a varying degree of results, but none of my tooth fungi have ever faded or lost their blue color. So it just really depends. And, like everything, there's no right way, there's no wrong way. It's just exploring and discovering and learning, what works for you and what you're most interested in trying to accomplish. I like working with cellulose fibers. Everyone says, oh, mushroom dyes don't work on cellulose fibers. And they do. Some mushrooms don't, some do. And for me, I love the color palette and range that I can get, but for other people, they just don't love that. And that's fine. But, so it just depends.
Nice. And actually, can you tell us about the art piece right behind your head there? That looks like embroidery on,
Yeah, so that's wool. Is it all wool? There might be some silk in there. But yeah, those are different exhaust baths of tooth fungi, because I really wanted to get kind of the greens and different shades of greens. I call it a strata piece, where I've cut the fabric to kind of look at the strata of what's happening below us and geologically over time, and then embroidering that bedrock over it. So that's about it. And then these guys here, oops, which way? These are my strainer bags.
Oh, really?
These are just crappy little silk bags I actually bought because I have to bag my dahlias on my flower farm, because I have such a huge problem with grasshoppers, because I've got a big hayfield and stuff. So I basically created a grasshopper buffet, and they then come in and eat holes in my dahlias, and then they don't work for cut flowers. Dahlias are also great dye flowers. And then I was like, well, I bought these bags that were too small for the blooms of dahlias. So I use them as strainer bags, and it's like just this gorgeous range of colors. So, it's just some crappy silk from wherever, but
great. It looks like the Korean piecing that we do with
the silk
and other fabrics. So
I know, I
Nice.
forget what that's called, or something. Yeah. Thanks.
Cool.
Well, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. All right.
Yeah, have a good night and